Negotiators assume that all negotiations involve a fixed pi. Now, integrative, interest-based negotiations are not what we call fixed pi. You don't have a fixed resource. In an integrative negotiation, you try to expand the pie by including your interests and your opponent's interests so that you both come out with a win-win. That make sense? Yes. You grow the pie. Okay. Anchoring and adjustment is the cognitive bias. It's the effect of the standard or anchor against which subsequent adjustments are measured. The anchor might be based on faulty or incomplete information, and thus it can be misleading. So if I make an assumption about my opponent, or I make an assumption about the item we're negotiating, okay, that would be a cognitive bias. Because my information, my perception about an item we're negotiating for may be wrong, okay? Issue framing and risk. Frames can lead people to seek, avoid, or be neutral about taking a risk in decision-making and negotiation. And remember I said that earlier today. There's a lot of risk in negotiation, okay? And if you're risk adverse, what does risk adverse mean? Anybody ever hear that term? Risk adverse. It means you are afraid of taking risks. You're risk adverse, meaning I want to play it safe. Okay? So if you're risk adverse, that can impact the framing of your negotiation process. Because if your opponent is taking risks and you're afraid to take risks, they may have more leverage. Number 5 is availability of information. Operates when information that is presented in vivid or attention-getting ways becomes easy to recall. It becomes central and critical in evaluating events and options. So it just depends on how the information is presented. If I'm selling you a car and I tell you this is the best car in the world, it's got this, it's got that, it goes very fast, it doesn't burn a lot of gas, and so on and so forth, I'm giving you a lot of information that you can easily remember through the course of the negotiation. Okay. This one we talked about before, but the actual name of it is the winner's curse. The tendency to settle quickly on an item and then subsequently feel discomfort about a win that comes too easily. So, my asking price on this car is $15,000. You immediately agree to pay the $15,000. So, did I get what I wanted? Well, yeah, I was asking $15,000. That was my top price. I got the $15,000. And then I stepped back after it and I said, I should have asked $20,000. The guy agreed to 15 right off the top. I probably could have got more. It's called the winner's curse. I win, and yet I feel like I could have done better. That's kind of a paranoia of people. But they call it the winner's curse. Okay? So be happy if you got what you wanted to get. Overconfidence is the tendency of negotiators to believe that their ability to be correct or accurate is greater than is actually true. Sometimes people feel that they are the subject matter expert on the item being negotiated, okay? When maybe they're really not, okay? But they portray themselves that way, okay? I'm the expert. The law of small numbers. The tendency of people to draw conclusions from small sample sizes. So, the smaller sample, the greater the possibility that past lessons will be erroneously used to infer what will happen in the future. So, if I'm a procurement person and I'm buying parts from a supplier, okay, the smaller amount of parts I buy, okay, the greater the possibility that I will erroneously infer what will happen in the future. So if I buy 100,000 pieces from you and they all work out well, the next time I'll place an order for 500,000 because I said, well, I didn't have any problem with the first 100,000, so now I'm going to increase my order. That sometimes doesn't work out that way. Okay? You have to be very careful. So sometimes you're better off dealing with smaller samples each time. Self-serving bias. People often explain another person's behavior by making attributions either to the person or to the situation. So there's a tendency to overestimate the role of personal or internal factors or underestimate the role of situational external factors. Self-serving bias is basically when you try to compliment the other person to death. Well, you're the expert, so I have to be guided by what you're telling me, okay? That's called self-serving bias, okay? You try to make the other person look like the subject matter expert, okay? That's a tactic, by the way. Endowment effect is the tendency to overvalue something you own or believe you possess. Years ago, I had a 1985 Mercury Cougar. Okay? Very fast car. Had a V8 engine. I think it was a 302 V8. Beautiful car. The endowment effect. I had a lot of people offer to buy that car from me. But because I had had it for many years, I had this personal connection to it. Okay? My personal connection became my own bias. In other words, I felt it was worth much more than it really was. Why? Because I had a personal connection. You can't have a personal connection to something and then try to sell it or negotiate a settlement, because the value to you personally is much greater than it is to the other person, or the value to you personally may be greater than the actual market price of that item. Does that make sense? That happens a lot. Cars, houses, we have a tendency to overprice them above what the market value is, simply because, well, they mean a lot to me. Well, that doesn't mean anything. Once you decide to sell something, that's it. Okay? Ignoring other cognition, so negotiators don't bother to ask about the other party's perceptions and thoughts. This leaves them to work with incomplete information and thus produces faulty results. So, you have to ask what some of the belief and opinions are of your opponent in order to have a successful negotiation. Okay? Again, that's more information sharing. And reactive devaluation is the process of devaluing the other party's concession simply because the other party made them. So, no matter if you have a very bad relationship with the person you're negotiating with, no matter what concessions they make to close the deal, you're going to find some fault with it. Oh, you could do better than that. Oh, you just don't like me. All right? No matter what they do, you devalue it. Okay? That's a cognitive bias as well. Now, do you need to know any of those for your exam? No, there's no question on the exam for that. Okay? That's the good news. How about positive emotions? Are these people very positive? Yeah. Either that or they just had too much caffeine. One or the other. Yeah, right. You're very happy that there's nothing from this chapter in the essay section of your exam. So, positive emotions generally produce positive outcomes. They lead toward more integrative process. They create a positive attitude towards the other party, the other side. They promote persistence and better outcomes, and fair procedures and favorable social comparisons, and they build positive feelings. And that's demonstrated by this group here. I would be very unhappy if I was in that group. I would not be very positive simply because I don't have any clothes. That's what I said. They have no clothes. I'm very positive. And then, of course, we have negative emotions.
He has no clothes.
That's probably why he just realized it. He looked in the mirror, realized he has no clothes. Or anything else. Negative emotions generally produce negative outcomes. So, positive emotions, positive outcomes. If you have negative emotions during negotiation, you're going to have negative outcomes. So, they may lead parties to define the situation as competitive or distributive. They may undermine a negotiator's ability to analyze the situation accurately, which adversely affects individual outcomes. It may lead parties to escalate the conflict. They may lead parties to retaliate and may thwart integrative outcomes. And not all negative emotion has the same effect. So negative emotions during negotiations frequently will wind up in distributive process. which is kind of like the question from the gentleman over here, who was asking earlier about when two countries are negotiating and you start with integrated, you wind up with distributive. It's because the negative emotions that are generated between those two opposing countries become so negative, the outcome becomes negative and distributive. That's one of the reasons, right there. As just ask this poor guy. Look at that poor face. Everybody got that? Hey, that was a quick one. That's what we like, quick. Well, I went through quick because it's not on the exam.
Do you have any choices?
That I don't know.